What if the most important battlefield in a modern war was not a desert? Or the sky above a country? What if it was a narrow stretch of water so small that a person could cross it in minutes? But every day, it carried the energy that powered the global economy. For decades, the world believed the Strait of Hormuz was simply a shipping route, a geographic feature, a blue line on a map. But in 2026, that blue line became something far more dangerous. A pressure point, a bargaining weapon, a test of whether a single country could challenge a global system without defeating a single major military. After months of conflict, the battle for Hormuz may not be decided by missiles. It may not be decided by aircraft. It may be decided by something far quieter, concrete. Ports, and the slow construction of a world where Iran's most powerful strategic advantage becomes less powerful every single day. Because the real question is not, can Iran control the Strait of Hormuz? The real question is, what happens when the world no longer depends on it? Look at a satellite image of the Persian Gulf. The geography seems almost impossible. A massive energy producing region surrounded by one narrow exit. To the north is Iran. To the south is Oman. Between them is the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, only a few dozen miles wide. But through this narrow passage flows something much larger than ships. Money. Global supply chains. Every day before this crisis, millions of barrels of oil and huge volumes of natural gas moved through this waterway. For countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iraq, Hormuz was not just a route. And that created the first strategic contradiction. The Gulf region contains some of the largest energy reserves on Earth. A fortress built on a single doorway, and Iran controlled the northern side of that doorway. This is what made Hormuz so powerful. Not because Iran controlled the world's oil. It did not. The deeper issue was that Iran could influence everyone else's ability to move it. That difference matters. Because controlling production is one form of power. Controlling access is another. And throughout history, controlling access has often been just as valuable. A country does not always need to own the resource. Sometimes it only needs to control the road. The corridor. The choke point. The Strait of Hormuz became exactly that. A geographic advantage transformed into strategic leverage. But here's the problem. Geography gives power. But geography also creates dependence. And dependence creates vulnerability. For years, Gulf states understood this risk. The cost of changing the system was enormous. Building new pipelines, creating alternative ports, developing new export routes. These projects require years, billions of dollars. So the old system remained. Oil moved through Hormuz. Markets accepted the risk. And governments hoped deterrence would be enough. Until the war changed the calculation. The world saw the visible battlefield. Missile launches. Naval movements. Commercial ships changing course. The images were dramatic. 8 anchors surrounded by uncertainty. A radar screen tracking incoming threats. A command center watching shipping routes disappear. But the part most people missed was what happened beneath the headlines. The war revealed that the Strait of Hormuz was not only a military target, it was an economic weapon. Because every ship that stopped moving created a chain reaction. Insurance prices increased. Shipping routes changed. Energy markets reacted. Governments started asking a different question. Not how do we protect this route? How do we become less dependent on it? The United States faced a difficult strategic problem. American military power could strike missile batteries. It could destroy launch sites. It could protect shipping lanes. But there was one thing military power could not change. The map. The Strait of Hormuz would still exist tomorrow. It would still exist next year. Iran would still sit beside it. This created the central contradiction of the entire conflict. The United States possessed overwhelming military capability. But military capability alone could not remove a geographic advantage. Because you cannot bomb geography. You cannot destroy a narrow waterway. You cannot eliminate a mountain. You cannot erase a coastline. You can only change how much strategic value that geography provides. And that requires something different. Not another missile. A new system. This is where the story moves from the battlefield into the infrastructure war. Because while the world was watching aircraft and missiles, another battle was already beginning. Far away from the explosions. At construction sites. At ports. Inside government planning rooms. The Gulf states started building an answer to Iran's geographic advantage. Not by attacking Hormuz, by reducing dependence on it. The idea was simple. If one door can be controlled, build another door. The most important example came from the United Arab Emirates. On the eastern side of the country sits Fujairah. Unlike major Gulf ports located inside the Persian Gulf, Fujairah faces the Gulf of Oman. That difference is everything. It bypasses the pressure point completely. The UAE had already built infrastructure connecting inland oil fields to Fujairah. But the war accelerated a much larger ambition. Increase the alternative route. Create a future where a greater share of Gulf energy could move without entering Iran's strategic neighborhood. The image is powerful. For decades, Iran controlled the doorway. Now, the Gulf states are building a second entrance. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. Because a second door does not mean the first door becomes irrelevant. The Strait of Hormuz still matters. A lot. The amount of energy historically moving through the waterway is far larger than existing bypass systems can completely replace. Pipelines can reduce vulnerability. They cannot erase it. And this creates another strategic contradiction. Infrastructure can weaken a country's leverage. But it does not automatically remove competition. Because every new pipeline creates a new question. Can it be protected? Can it survive a longer conflict? Can it prevent another form of pressure from replacing the old one? Iran understands this better than almost anyone. In fact, Iran built its own alternative route years earlier. A pipeline connecting Iranian oil fields to the Gulf of Oman. The reason was simple. Tehran understood the danger of depending on a single exit. The country that used Hormuz as leverage against others had already prepared a backup plan for itself. And that reveals something important. The battle was never really about one waterway. The battle was about resilience. Who could continue operating when the system was under pressure? Who could adapt faster? Who could absorb disruption longer? Because modern wars are no longer decided only by weapons. A missile can destroy a target. But it cannot always destroy a strategy. A drone can interrupt shipping. But it cannot permanently control global energy flows. A blockade can create fear. But fear creates a response. And the response to vulnerability is usually adaptation. That is the hidden war taking place around Hormuz. Not only a fight over ships. A fight over dependence. The world saw Iran using a narrow waterway as leverage. But the deeper question was already emerging. How long can a country maintain strategic power when everyone else is investing billions to escape that dependence? Because the Strait of Hormuz has always been more than a piece of geography. It has been a calculation about risk, a calculation about alternatives, a calculation about who has the ability to force others to make difficult choices. For the first time in decades. But the biggest shift is not happening at sea. It is happening somewhere much harder to see. Inside the systems behind the war. Because the next phase of this conflict will not be decided only by who controls the Strait of Hormuz. It will be decided by who controls the decisions surrounding it. But here's the problem. The world is looking at the wrong battlefield. For 5 months, Every camera has been pointed upward, toward missiles crossing the sky, toward aircraft launching from carriers, toward explosions lighting up the Persian Gulf, toward B-2 bombers sitting inside American bases thousands of miles away. But the most important movement of this war may not be happening above Iran. A room where military commanders are asking a question no weapon can answer. Not can we fight? Should we continue? Because that is the moment when a military conflict changes. Not when one side loses a missile. Not when one aircraft is destroyed. But when the people responsible for using force begin calculating whether force itself is still producing a strategic result. And this is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes more than a waterway, more than an energy route, more than a geographic choke point. It becomes a test of institutional survival, because the real battle was never only about controlling the sea. The real battle was about controlling decisions. Everyone thinks this conflict is about missiles and ships, but the deeper battle is about who controls the machine that launches them. And that changes everything. Because the most powerful weapon inside any military organization is not a missile. A military can survive losing equipment. It can replace damaged vehicles. It can rebuild radar stations. But when political goals and military reality move in opposite directions, the entire system begins to experience internal friction. And friction is where wars are often decided. Look at the image. Not a missile launch. Not a battlefield. A command center. A map on the wall. A group of officers looking at shrinking options. Because every military organization eventually faces the same calculation. How much capability remains? How much risk can be accepted? And what happens if the next decision creates more damage than advantage? The lesson here is simple. Military power is not only measured by what a country can destroy. It is measured by what a country can continue doing after destruction begins. The Revolutionary Guard was designed around a very specific idea. Survival through asymmetry. Iran knew it could not match the United States aircraft for aircraft, ship for ship, satellite for satellite. So it built another model. Drones. Proxy networks. Geography. Political influence. The strategy was never to defeat American power directly. The strategy was to make American power expensive. And for years, a small drone could force a carrier group to spend millions on defense. A small fast boat could force commercial ships to change routes. A threat against Hormuz could move global energy prices. The weapon was not always the attack. The weapon was the uncertainty created before the attack. But here's the contradiction. A strategy built around creating uncertainty also creates uncertainty inside your own command structure. Because once escalation begins, can we pressure the enemy? Can we survive the pressure we created? This is the invisible battlefield most people never see. The battlefield of endurance. On satellite images, analysts can see damaged facilities. They can see destroyed launch sites. They can count aircraft. They can measure explosions. Confidence. Confidence between commanders. Confidence between political leaders and military officers. Confidence that the next order has a realistic objective. And when that confidence begins disappearing, a military enters a dangerous phase. Not because it becomes weak overnight, but because every future decision becomes slower, more complicated, more uncertain. And uncertainty inside a military system can be as damaging as uncertainty imposed on an enemy. This explains why the internal IRGC conflict matters strategically. Not because it proves the war is over. It does not. Not because it guarantees negotiations will succeed. They may fail. But because it changes the calculation behind every future decision. Escalation had a simple logic. Political leaders could order action. Military commanders executed. The system moved. Now the question is different. Can political leaders still convert intention into military action? That is the critical variable. Because a military organization is not just a collection of weapons. Orders move downward. Information moves upward. Break either connection, and the system slows. Now look beyond Iran. Look at Washington. Look at the Gulf states. Look at the energy markets. Because this internal shift connects directly to a much larger strategic question. Who actually benefits when a military crisis creates pressure inside an opponent's command structure? The answer is not always the strongest military. Sometimes it is the side that can maintain pressure without forcing the opponent into total resistance. This is why the B-2 bombers matter. Not only because of what they can destroy, but because of what their existence changes before they ever fly. A bomber sitting on a runway is already a strategic message. It creates a calculation. If we escalate, what comes next? The aircraft itself is powerful, but the uncertainty around the aircraft may be even more powerful. The same applies to naval forces. The same applies to submarines. The same applies to sanctions. The same applies to energy pressure. Modern warfare is increasingly about shaping decisions before battles happen. And this creates another contradiction. America has overwhelming military superiority. But military superiority does not automatically create political outcomes. History has shown this repeatedly. A stronger military can destroy targets, but it cannot always force an opponent to choose the outcome you want. That requires something else. A pressure system. Military pressure. Economic pressure. Diplomatic pressure. Information pressure. All working together. The bigger picture is that the United States is not only trying to defeat Iranian weapons. That is a completely different type of warfare. Now return to the original hero of this story. At first glance, it appears to be a geographic problem. A narrow waterway. A point on a map. But the deeper reality is different. The Strait of Hormuz is a strategic amplifier. It gives a country with limited conventional power the ability to influence a much larger system. That is why the Gulf states are building alternatives. Because once a system experiences vulnerability, it rarely returns completely to the old version. The pipeline bypasses, the alternative ports, the new shipping routes, the military deployments, all of them represent the same idea. Reduce dependence. Reduce the power of a single point of failure. But here's the final contradiction. Reducing vulnerability does not remove competition. It changes where competition happens. If Hormuz becomes less powerful as a pressure point, another battlefield emerges. Technology, undersea infrastructure, energy networks, space systems, financial pressure. The future conflict may not begin with ships entering a narrow strait. It may begin with invisible systems being tested long before anyone sees a battlefield. Because the lesson of Hormuz is bigger than Hormuz. A country does not need to defeat an enemy's military to change the balance of power. Sometimes it only needs to force the enemy to spend more resources defending every possible weakness. Who controls the strongest weapon? The real question is where and how those weapons are used. Because future wars may not be decided only by the side with more missiles. They may be decided by the side whose institutions can survive uncertainty longer. Iran built a strategy around making the world afraid of one narrow waterway. The United States and its allies responded by trying to make that waterway less decisive. But now a new question emerges. And alliances begin removing geography's advantage. Do you think future wars will be won by superior weapons? Or by the countries that build the most resilient systems?